Good day. I'm really pleased that you have taken the time to really listen to what God has in store for you today. I hope and I pray that this message touches your heart, speaks to your circumstances, and more importantly, that you would walk away with a promise today. The title of my message is Why Have You Forsaken Me? Funny enough, it's the title of Psalm 22, which we will explore today. Now, I don't know if you are familiar with this phrase. Maybe you have said it in your life and in your prayer life where you have reached a place in your circumstance where you cry out to God, say, God, why have you forsaken me? You are not alone. David did the same. Now, we are not fully aware of the circumstances that led David to compile such a psalm. But we do know that the person, be it David or someone else, were suffering and they felt like God has abandoned them. What is interesting about this psalm is that it is actually a prayer. And when we read it as a prayer, we can see that it kind of resembles our own prayers, especially when we are in difficult circumstances. What do I mean? I will take you through it. First of all, we usually cry out to God and we let Him know that we want an answer and that we are really, really desperate for it. David does this in verse 1 to 2. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, from the words of my groaning? Now that sounds really familiar to me. I know if I complain, I usually groan. Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. And then we usually, because we are human, we reminiscent over what God has done for others. And we usually want to see, why God, why are you helping Mary? Why are you helping our leaders? Why are you helping my mother, but you're not helping me? Aren't I good enough? Aren't I trusting you enough? But once again, you are not alone. David does the same. In verse 4 to 5, he says, In you our fathers trusted. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried and were rescued. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. And then there comes a stage when we feel that God really isn't answering us. So we usually, because once again we are human, we usually start listening to those people who surround us, good or bad. And we start believing what they say. Now, if it's bad and you start believing it, you usually feel insignificant because they talk you so down, as they did with David, that you feel insignificant like a worm, easily squashed. Unfortunately, this is what David felt like in verse 6 to 7. He says, But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me, they wag their heads, and then you can, I think it's in verse 7 to 8, then you can read what he says they are accusing him of. They are kind of like mocking him like little children, you're God. Which I think most of us have reached this point in our lives where we have heard those mocking sounds and mocking words from people as well. So as long as you don't believe it, you're okay. And then we really reach a point where we are conflicted. Usually we reach a point in our prayer life where we are conflicted because we hear what people are saying, but we know our circumstance, but we know that God is our God, that we can trust Him and that we can only rely on Him to come to our aid. And David has reached this point in verse 9 to 12, where 9 to 10, where he compares God to a midwife who catches a helpless baby at birth. Usually, similarly, in a difficult circumstances and difficult situation or whatever, we usually want God to catch us as well. I think we usually want Him not as much as a midwife. I don't think we would really compare him to a midwife in modern times, I think we would really compare him to a lifesaver or thing that is familiar to us. So you can compare him to a lifesaver if you would like. However, what is very interesting to me is the point in the passage. It is not really clear, but there's a point in the passage where we can see that God actually answers David's prayer. From verse 12 to 18, we see that the person, let's say it is David, because there is really this debate or if it's David or someone else, but let's say it's David. His circumstances are getting really severe in these verses. He is surrounded by enemies that he describes as being strong bulls of Bashan. Now, these bulls are like our Brahmans, but I think they are a bit tougher. But they are like our Brahmans, very well fed, and you wouldn't want to play with them in a camp. He describes his enemies as being lions that are tearing and roaring. If you were ever in the Kruger National Park and you had the privilege to witness lions tearing at their prey, it is not a really nice scene, especially if you are at the prey end. I think you would need prayer if you're at the prayer end. So I'm not really completely wrong at that stage. He also describes them as dogs that show no mercy. They viciously attack him. Now, these aren't your pets that sleep in your bed and wag their tails. These are really ferocious dogs. They are the scum of the ancient world. They roamed around looking for bodies that were killed, or they licked up blood, and they were just vicious. They probably, in our modern times, we would say that they carried rabies. I think that is that type of vicious dog you would just stay away from. And they viciously attacked him. He said in that verse that he is but bones. So you can imagine that he is really weak. He has no resources to fight off any attacks from any enemy that comes his way. Understandably, such circumstances, if you feel that weak and you are surrounded by that many vicious enemies, you would fear for your life, and you would be reduced to only fear and weakness, and that is what happened to David. He says in verse 14 that his strength is gone. It is poured out like water. He's out of control. All his bones are out of joint. And his courage melts away. Now, in that verse, he said his heart is like wax that melted. Now, in their train of thought and how they thought is that courage, that your heart is the seat of courage. So his courage melted away like his heart melted away like wax. And that is really not a nice, very picture. But if we read this, we think, okay, now where did God step in? Because just right after this, he said that God has rescued him. And then he had this epiphany that God is answering him. Now we would be inclined to think that, okay, the circumstances have gotten so severe, now God has answered. And you would be wrong to assume this, because I don't think God works that way. He doesn't wait for us to be really desperate or being torn apart by bulls, dogs, or lions. But I think that it is the stage in our life where we are really acting upon trust, where we powerfully call on God to our aid. And that is exactly what David did. Now, like I said, we do not know what exactly happened, because in verse 19 to 21, we don't know, because it is not clear what happened that David had this epiphany that God is answering him. But I would like to believe that, like I said, David's circumstances have pushed him so much that he has opened himself to what God is saying, and that he has realized that there is no other way than to fully trust him. And we can see this because in verse 11 he told us that there is none to help. So he already had this realization that there will be no one to help him, that it is only God that will come to his aid. From there he shares the truth of what I believe God has revealed to him about his circumstances, especially. In verse 24, 26, 27, and especially 31, we can see these truths, and I will read some of them. In verse 24, we can see he says, "For he has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and he has not hidden his face from him, but has heard when he cried to him." Now that is a really special verse, and I think if you ever want to go into a circumstance and you just want a quick verse, go to verse 24 of Psalm 22. In verse 26 he said, "The afflicted shall eat and be satisfied." And in verse 31 he says, "They shall come and proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn, that he has done it." Now I like that little fragment of verse 31 so much, that he has done it. I think this is a really good verse to keep in your mind, and we will see why I really like this verse. When we read this psalm today, it is not difficult for us to identify this specific enemy that is surrounding us, and that we can liken to what David has described his enemies to be. But, however, if you feel that this is your enemy, even if it's reduced you to fear and weakness, I would like you to hold on to verse 24, 26, and especially 31. When you feel surrounded by these circumstances that you are faced with now, and your fear, proclaim God's righteousness to your circumstances, and tell your circumstances and fear that God has done it, that he has done what he has promised to do, and that he has done what verse 24 says. And I think we can go back to that verse just to really let it sink in what God is saying to us. "For he has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and he has not hidden his face from him, but he has heard when he cried to him." Now that verse for me, and I believe for you as well, means that even if you are afflicted, he has not despised you or abhorred you, has not turned his face towards your prayers or your circumstances. He sees everything, and he will come to your aid. And if you feel that you are not in that situation at the moment where you are frightened or surrounded by an enemy or enemies, I would like you to do what verse 22 says, that you would give testimony of what God has done in your life, and that you would continue to praise him. God knows that your testimony is needed now more than ever. I thank you.